The Kenyan coastal city of Mombasa bowed to no one, but it bowed to Jabari Kenyatta. At 35, he ruled the underworld with an iron fist stained with the blood of those who had dared to cross him. They called him the Lion, not for his courage, but for his ferocity when cornered. Tonight, the warm Indian Ocean breeze carried the scent of jasmine as Jabari's gleaming black Mercedes pulled up outside Club Nyota, the crown jewel in his empire of nightclubs, smuggling operations, and protection rackets. The bouncer's eyes widened with recognition before he stepped aside, allowing Jabari and his two bodyguards to enter without a word. Inside, the bass thundered through the packed dance floor as colored lights swept across bodies moving in hypnotic rhythm. Jabari's eyes narrowed as he scanned the room, noting the drug deals happening in shadowy corners, all paying their tribute to him. "The Somalis are causing trouble again," murmured Adissa, his right-hand man, as they made their way to Jabari's private booth overlooking the dance floor. They tried to move product through the northern route without paying the fee. Jabari's jaw tightened. "Make an example of their lieutenant. Something public." Adissa nodded, his face betraying no emotion. This was business, and in their world, reputation was everything. The Somali cartels had been testing Jabari's boundaries for months, and weakness would only invite more aggression. As Jabari sipped his whiskey, a commotion near the bar caught his attention. A young woman was arguing with one of his men, her face flushed with anger as she gesticulated wildly. Even from a distance, Jabari was struck by her fearlessness, a rare quality in his world of cowering subordinates. "What's happening there?" he asked, nodding toward the confrontation. "Some teacher claiming we're recruiting her students," Adissa replied with a dismissive wave. "Says she's going to report us to the authorities." Jabari's interest was piqued. In a city where his name inspired hushed whispers, this woman was openly challenging his operation. Without thinking, he stood and made his way down to the bar. As he approached, he caught fragments of her impassioned speech. "Just 16 years old. Children who deserve education, not crime. Is there a problem here?" Jabari asked, his deep voice cutting through the music. The woman turned, momentarily startled by his presence. "Yes, there is. Your employees are luring my students into whatever illegal business you're running here." Up close, Jabari was struck by her beauty, not the manufactured glamour of the women who usually surrounded him, but something authentic and fierce. Her eyes, like polished obsidian, held his gaze without flinching. "And you are?" he asked, intrigued despite himself. "Ayana Okafor. I teach at St. Margaret's Secondary School." She crossed her arms, unimpressed by his expensive suit and commanding presence. "And you're ruining the futures of children who could become doctors, engineers, or teachers." Something about her righteous anger stirred Jabari in a way he hadn't felt in years. He found himself saying, "Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere quieter." That night, over coffee at a 24-hour cafe far from his usual haunts, Jabari listened as Ayana spoke passionately about her students, their potential, and the obstacles they faced. She had no idea who he really was. To her, he was simply Jabari, the businessman who owned the club. And for those brief hours, he allowed himself to become that man, leaving the weight of his true identity behind. As dawn broke over the Indian Ocean, Jabari watched Ayana leave in a taxi, her number now in his phone. For the first time in years, he felt something dangerous stirring in his chest, not the familiar danger of his world, but something far more threatening to the empire he had built, hope. 2 months passed like a fever dream. Jabari created a careful divide between his worlds. By day, he was the charming businessman courting the passionate teacher. By night, he remained the ruthless Mafia lord. He kept Ayana away from Club Nyota and his other businesses, meeting her instead at quiet restaurants, art galleries, and once for a weekend trip to the pristine beaches of Lamu Island. With Ayana, Jabari rediscovered parts of himself long buried under years of violence and power. She spoke of literature, showed him the beauty of teaching young minds, and challenged his cynical worldview with her stubborn optimism. Most dangerously, she made him imagine a different life, one where he wasn't constantly watching for knives aimed at his back. "You're different today," Ayana said one evening as they walked along the beachfront, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Quieter." Earlier that day, Jabari had ordered the execution of a police officer who had threatened to expose one of his smuggling routes. The man had left behind a wife and 2 children. The weight of it pressed on his chest, heavier than usual. "Just business problems," he replied, squeezing her hand. Ayana studied his face. "You know, you never really talk about your work. All these months, and I still don't know what your business actually involves." The question hung between them like a blade. Jabari had rehearsed his cover story countless times, but suddenly the lies tasted bitter in his mouth. Before he could respond, his phone rang, Adissa's special tone. "Excuse me," he said, stepping away to answer. Adissa's voice was tense. "The Somalis hit our warehouse at the port. 6 men dead. They took the shipment." Cold rage washed through Jabari. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. When he returned to Ayana, her expression had changed. "You have to go," she stated, not a question. "I'm sorry. It's an emergency." He kissed her forehead, inhaling the scent of her coconut hair oil. "I'll call you tomorrow." As his car sped toward the port, Jabari compartmentalized his emotions with practiced efficiency. By the time he arrived at the bloody scene, all thoughts of Ayana were locked away, and the lion had returned. The retaliation was swift and brutal. By dawn, 3 Somali lieutenants had been found hanging from the cranes at the port, a message no one in Mombasa could misinterpret. But the escalation brought unwanted attention. News reports spoke of gang warfare and criminal enterprises, with grainy photos of crime scenes splashed across newspapers and TV screens. Ayana called him repeatedly, but Jabari was too deep in the crisis to respond. When he finally called her back 3 days later, her voice was cold. "I saw your photo in the newspaper today," she said without preamble. Jabari's blood froze. "What?" "At the governor's business luncheon. I didn't know you moved in such powerful circles." There was a pause. "There's something you're not telling me, Jabari." "Who are you, really?" Relief washed over him, followed immediately by shame. "It's complicated, Ayana. I'm a secondary school teacher. I understand complicated." Her voice softened. "Whatever it is, just be honest with me." The longing to confess nearly overwhelmed him. How liberating would it be to unburden himself, to be known fully by this woman who had somehow breached his defenses. But the truth would destroy everything. Ayana, with her moral certainty and faith in justice, could never love the man he truly was. "Let me take you to dinner tomorrow," he said instead. "There's a new place on Nyali Beach." As he hung up, Jabari felt the walls of his carefully constructed double life beginning to crumble. And in the shadows, his enemies watched and waited, sensing weakness in the lion for the first time. The attack came without warning. As Jabari left his downtown office building, the legitimate face of his empire, gunmen opened fire from a passing motorcycle. Only his bodyguard's quick reaction saved his life, pushing him back through the building's doors as bullets shattered glass around them. "It's the Somalis," Adissa said later, as the doctor removed a bullet fragment from Jabari's shoulder in the private clinic he kept on his payroll. "They're getting bolder." But it wasn't just the Somalis. Blood in the water had attracted all manner of sharks. His Colombian suppliers were questioning his control over distribution routes. Police officials who had been on his payroll for years suddenly demanded more money. Even within his own organization, he sensed shifting loyalties as rumors spread that the lion was distracted, weakened by a woman. The truth was, they weren't wrong. For the first time in his violent ascent to power, Jabari found himself hesitating. Each order for retribution was weighed against how Ayana would judge him if she knew. Each new criminal venture was viewed through her eyes, eyes that had looked at him with respect and affection, not fear. "We need to send a message," Adissa insisted during a tense meeting with their captains. "Show them the consequences of challenging us." The old Jabari would have already been planning the brutal spectacle that would restore his fearsome reputation. Instead, he found himself asking, what about expanding the legitimate businesses? The shipping company, the real estate holdings? His men exchanged concerned glances. This was not the lion they knew. Later that night, as Jabari sat in his fortified penthouse overlooking the twinkling lights of Mombasa, his phone lit up with Ayana's call. Seeing her name sent a wave of longing through him so intense it was almost painful. "I've missed you," she said when he answered. "These business emergencies of yours are becoming quite the pattern." "I'm sorry," he replied, meaning it more than she could know. "Things have been complicated." "Jabari," her voice grew serious, "I think I know what's going on." His heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "The secret of phone calls, the bodyguards you think I haven't noticed, the way you avoid talking about your work." She took a deep breath. "Are you involved in something illegal?" The moment stretched between them, taut with possibilities. One lie could preserve what they had built, but something in him had changed. The thought of continuing to deceive her was suddenly unbearable. "Yes," he said simply, the word falling like a stone into still water. The silence that followed seemed endless. "I want to see you," she finally said. "Tomorrow. And I want the truth, Jabari. All of it." After they hung up, Jabari made his decision. He would tell her everything, and then he would leave it all behind, the power, the money, the respect built on fear. He would dismantle his empire piece by piece if necessary. But first, he needed to ensure they would be safe. There was no clean break from his world, too many people would see his departure as an opportunity or a betrayal. He needed leverage, insurance policies, and exit strategies. Through the night, he worked methodically, calling in favors, moving money to offshore accounts, and preparing documentation that implicated powerful figures in his operations, to be released if anything happened to him or Ayana. By dawn, Jabari had the beginnings of a plan. It would take months to execute properly, but for the first time, he could see a path forward, a future beyond the blood and shadows that had defined his existence. As the sun rose over the Indian Ocean, casting golden light across the city he had both terrorized and protected, Jabari allowed himself to hope. But in his world, hope was the most dangerous emotion of all. The cafe where they agreed to meet was neutral territory, a small Italian place in a tourist area where neither Jabari's enemies nor friends were likely to be watching. He arrived early, dismissing his security to wait in cars positioned at both ends of the street. This conversation needed to be private. When Ayana walked in, her face was composed but her eyes betrayed her anxiety. She sat across from him, placing her hands flat on the table. "I'm listening," she said simply. And so Jabari told her everything, from his childhood in the slums of Kibra, to his rise through Mombasa's criminal hierarchy, to the empire he now controlled. He spoke of things he had never voiced aloud, the lives he had taken or ordered taken, the corruption he had fostered, the communities ravaged by the drugs he distributed. With each confession, he watched her expression change, saw her mentally reconciling the man she had grown to love with the monster now revealed. When he finished, the silence between them was heavy with the weight of his sins. "Say something," he finally whispered. Ayana's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I should walk away right now. Everything I believe in, everything I teach my students about right and wrong." She shook her head. "But I keep thinking about the man I've known these past months. Was any of that real?" "That was more real than anything in my life has ever been," Jabari said, reaching for her hand. To his surprise, she didn't pull away. "And I want to leave it all behind. For you. For us. For the man I could be." "Can you?" she challenged. "Can someone just walk away from what you've built?" Not easily, he admitted. But I have a plan. It will take time, but I can dismantle things carefully, transition legitimate businesses to trusted people, make arrangements with rivals. It's possible. What he didn't tell her was how dangerous it would be, how many would see his exit as weakness to be exploited, how quickly allies would become enemies once they sensed his resolve was gone. Ayana was silent for a long moment. I need time to think, she finally said, standing up. It's too much to process at once. Jabari nodded, his throat tight. I understand. As she turned to leave, gunfire erupted outside. The windows of the cafe shattered as bullets tore through the space. Acting on instinct, Jabari tackled Ayana to the floor, covering her body with his own as glass and debris rained down around them. Stay down, he commanded, pulling a concealed pistol from his ankle holster. Through the broken windows, he could see his security team engaged in a firefight with attackers in 2 vehicles. Civilians screamed and ran for cover as the peaceful street transformed into a war zone. Are you hit? He asked Ayana, quickly checking her for injuries. She shook her head, eyes wide with terror. Jabari, what's happening? This is my world, he said grimly. And it's not letting go without a fight. Using overturned tables as cover, Jabari led Ayana through the kitchen and out the back door to where one of his drivers was already waiting, alerted by the gunfire. As they sped away, Jabari made rapid calls, mobilizing his network to identify the attackers and secure safe passage out of the city. At a secluded safe house on the outskirts of Mombasa, Jabari paced while Ayana sat silently, still processing the violence she had witnessed. This is what leaving looks like, she said finally. People trying to kill you, to kill us. Jabari couldn't deny it. The attempt today was sloppy, opportunistic. Someone spotted me without my usual security. But yes, this is the reality we face. We? She questioned, looking up at him. I understand if you want no part of this, he said softly. I can arrange for you to leave the country tonight, new identity, enough money to start over somewhere safe. You would never have to see me again. Ayana stood, closing the distance between them. All those months ago, I confronted you at your club because I believed my students deserved better choices than the ones your world offered them. Her hand came up to rest against his cheek. Don't you deserve better choices too? The hope that bloomed in his chest was almost painful. You would stay? Even knowing everything? I'm not promising forever, she cautioned. But I'm not walking away, either. Not yet. What you've done can't be undone, Jabari. But what you do next, that's still your choice. In that moment, Jabari Kenyatta made his final decision. The lion would retreat, not with a roar but with calculated precision. He would use the very skills that had built his criminal empire to dismantle it, negotiation, strategy, and when necessary, controlled violence. It took 9 months. 9 months of careful maneuvering, of strategic concessions and calculated shows of force. 9 months during which Ayana waited, sometimes at his side, sometimes from a distance, but always present in his thoughts as the reason for everything. The day finally came when Jabari signed over his last significant criminal enterprise, his network of smuggling routes, to a consortium of former rivals who had paid handsomely for the territory and connections. As he walked away from the meeting, he felt lighter than he had in decades. That evening, as the sun set over the Indian Ocean, Jabari and Ayana stood on the deck of a small yacht heading south toward new horizons. Are you sure they'll let you go? She asked, leaning against the railing beside him. No, he answered honestly. Some might still come looking. But I've made it costly enough that most will decide it's not worth the trouble. He turned to face her. I can't promise it will be easy. But I can promise that every day, I'll try to be the man you believed I could be. Ayana smiled, taking his hand in hers. That's enough to start with. As darkness fell and the lights of Mombasa faded behind them, Jabari Kenyatta, no longer the lion, no longer a king of shadows, embraced the uncertain future with the woman who had given him the courage to seek redemption. The path ahead would not be simple or safe, but for the first time in his life, it would be his own choice. And that made all the difference.